Okay, so welcome everybody. Oops. So we're still waiting for people, are we?
We can start introductions as people are coming in. Okay,
so welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to welcome Yoshua Bengio as a speaker today. So as a brief introduction, so Yoshua has 3 degrees from McGill University in computer engineering, computer science, and cognitive science. He did his PhD there in 1991. So then he did 2 postdocs, one at MIT and one at Bell Labs. And then he returned to Montreal to the other institution, University of Montreal, where he's been a faculty member ever since. So Yoshua has contributed to more aspects of deep learning than anyone else. And for that, he was awarded the Turing Award in 2018. So I'll just mention 2 of his contributions, which everyone knows about: high-dimensional word embeddings for natural language processing, and different areas, generative adversarial networks. So it's a great pleasure to have Yoshua speaking to us today. And today's topic is generative flow networks. So thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Actually, I didn't do my PhD in cognitive science. It would have been appropriate, but it was in computer science. And so today is going to be very computer sciencey as well, and talking about some recent work in machine learning that I'm very excited about, and that's why I'm happy to discuss this today with you. I'll be happy to take questions in the middle. Please just use the chat, and hopefully somebody will raise that point to me, and also at the end. So let me share my screen. Okay, so generative flow networks, what does that mean? It's going to take a few, maybe 10 or 20 minutes for me to explain that, but there is a paper that you can find online that's been accepted to this NeurIPS called Flow Network-Based Generative Models for Non-Iterative Diverse Candidate Generation. That's a mouthful. And you see some keywords there already, like generative models. Leslie mentioned GANs. These are some of the early generative models we worked on. Actually, we worked on both machines in the 2000s. And, but there's another keyword here that helps to understand what's particular about this approach: diverse candidate generation. So this is something that we found useful in this project, in the discovery of new molecules, and I'll explain why this sort of discovery and exploration aspect is so interesting. And we have another manuscript which should be on archive by the end of the month called GFlowNets Foundations, which is more mathematical, and explains some things that we can do with GFlowNets, and that I'll also talk about that today. And I want to acknowledge all the people who have been working with me: Emmanuel, Mox, Maxine, Doina, Tristan, Edward, Mo, and Salem. Before I go into GFlowNets, let me give you a bit, 2 motivations why I found these things interesting. But later at the end, you'll see, I believe, that this style of machine learning systems could potentially have a much broader range of applications. So the first application I have in mind is one that I've been working on for a few years now. That is how we can do things like reasoning or system 2 cognition, and things we do at a conscious level in deep nets. And the another contribution that the Turing Award celebrated was the work we did on attention mechanisms. And attention is one of these ingredients that has been put in deep learning that is really changing the game towards the ability to do high-level reasoning. But specifically, there is a question that comes up if we're trying to imitate the kind of reasoning that humans are able to do. Let's say you see a video and you'd like to come up with a kind of structured story that explains it. So let's say that I see in my garden a cat chasing a squirrel, and then the squirrel climbing a tree to avoid the cat. So you could imagine coming up with a graph, if you want like a parse tree, but more about the semantics of the interactions between the different entities in my story. And in that story, you will also notice that we're gonna ignore a lot of the details that are in the video. So how could a machine learning system produce these kinds of graphs, sample among the posterior distribution among these graphs, and marginalize over the aspects of the data that we don't really care about for some reason, maybe because we are looking for these abstractions, or because it's not as relevant to what matters to my rewards. So that's one motivation, being able to represent, sample, and marginalize over complex data structures like sets and graphs with neural nets. Second motivation is about the drug discovery that I already mentioned. And I'll talk about a specific approach to the exploration in the space of molecules. We are also exploring how to use this for the discovery of new materials. It's essentially the same algorithms. And the GFlowNet that I already mentioned as a generative model is going to help us in one part of that, which is to propose to sample candidates. And and molecules can be represented with graphs often. So again, we have this machinery for generating graphs according to some distribution that is not specified in a way that's completely usable. And so we need to find a transfer between the information we have about that distribution and an actual sampling machine that will produce these candidates in an IAD fashion. Okay, so let me actually go a little bit deeper into this. This is a setup that's pretty close to the model-based reinforcement learning setup. For those of you who know about reinforcement learning, you can also think about model predictive control and things like this, where you need to take a sequence of decisions and you have a way to evaluate whether a candidate decision is good or not. And that would typically be too expensive. Maybe I'm going to have to run an experiment on a new drug or a new material. So you build a model, and the model is trained on data that has been acquired from these experiments. So these are the actors in the figure here. On the right, you see the real world, like the experimental bench. If you want to think of it as an oracle, it may be deterministic or it may be stochastic. It has as input specifications for an experiment, and we're going to call that a query to the oracle. And it produces outcomes. The simplest case, the outcome might be just a number, and would like this number to be high, say, because we're searching for, say, a drug that will bind to a target protein, or we're looking for a material that has a desired property at the highest possible level. Then in the middle, you see the world model. That's why there is a globe. It's not the real thing, as you notice. It's kind of a cartoon of reality. And it's going to get updated using the data that we observe. And the world model can be trained in a fairly standard way. It's like supervised learning. The only particular aspect to it is that we'd like not only our model to be predictive, so we could say, like, what would be the outcome if I try this experiment? So it would predict what the outcome would be, but it should also be able to produce a sort of uncertainty, an epistemic uncertainty. Epistemic uncertainty means the part of the uncertainty or the error that is reducible, would be reducible if only I had more data and of course enough compute. And the reason this matters is this is going to drive the guy on the left, the imagination machine, the generative model, because we'd like to propose experiments that are going to provide us with new information. So this exploration, think of a child that exploring their environment. They're curious about the things they don't know or the places, the experiments where they might learn the most. Think also about a scientist who's designing experiments. So this whole area here is related to experimental design, where I'd like to use my machine learning tools to interact with the experimental system and come up with a series of queries of experiments to do that will teach me something about the world, maybe find solutions to a problem. And so the model that I build in the middle is never perfect, it's going to have uncertainty, and we're trying to bridge that gap so that the model is good, at least in the aspects that it models that we care about. Okay, so that's the big picture. And now I'm going to go into, so the crux of what these GFlowNets, these generative flow networks are, have been designed to do. So easy explanation, they're doing essentially what a MCMC, Monte Carlo Markov chain method, would do. In other words, given a real valued function, and you can think in terms of physics as like an energy function, we're going to convert that into a distribution. So, for example, we can take e to the minus energy, and the problem is we don't know the normalizing constant of that distribution function, the z here, and we don't have an easy way to sample from that distribution. So we are able to say how good a candidate X is. So these are, remember, the X here is going to be the candidate experiment, and R of X is going to be how good we think it is relative to others, or the energy, you know, how bad it is. And would like to come up with an algorithm that eventually will sample new experiments, new X's, with just the right probability, that is, with a probability proportional to that reward function R, or e to the minus energy, that unnormalized probability function. So we'd like to convert, if you want, a measure to a generative model. And in principle, there's a completely general principle, a general approach to do that with Monte Carlo Markov chains, but there are some issues. And in high dimensional spaces, in the kind of AI problems I've been working with for a few decades, MCMC methods often fail us. And the main issue that I'll try to explain in the next slide is what we call the mode mixing challenge. And we're going to try to deal with this by using machine learning to do a job that it seems to be intractable for MCMC. So let me try to explain the issue with MCMC. So the way that MCMC methods sample configurations given an energy function or given an unnormalized probability function. So we'd like to sample from the what's called the Gibbs distribution of that energy function. In other words, it's the problem I set up in the previous slide. Right? We have a function, it's like a positive function. We would like to sample from a distribution that corresponds to that, but how could we do that? And the way it's done in MCMC methods is to start from some initial configuration X and create a sequence of potential solutions by making small changes, small random changes. So you move around in that space and you tend to go towards the modes of the distribution, the high values of the reward or the low energies. But sometimes you allow to go up, and with the right setting of these methods, you're in fact guaranteed that if you wait long enough, this chain will visit all the places, and in particular will visit them in proportion to their probability. So it will visit all the modes. And by the way, why do we want to visit all the modes, or as many of the modes as possible? Because if you think about my initial problem with molecules, I'd like to discover new molecules. Really, I'm interested in all the types of solutions that exist. So often chemists will come up with some solutions, but really would like to use computers to help suggest potentially very different solutions. And if there are like 20 different types of solutions, I'd like to discover them. So really we're after covering as many of the modes as possible. And if we were able to sample in proportion to this goodness, this reward function, that will automatically give us all the modes. But the problem with MCMC is, you start somewhere maybe near a mode, and then it may be difficult for the chain to go and find a neighboring mode. It may be difficult because it has to do a large number of steps, random steps, each of which has a probability that may become smaller and smaller if it needs to go towards less and less probable configurations. And to go from like very probable configurations in one mode to other very probable configurations, you have to go through this desert of low probability where you're going to die of thirst before you get to the other place. That's what's going on. And in fact, it may take exponential time to cross these deserts. Now, if the modes are like wide enough, you can throw darts in that space and be lucky and find those modes. But if you're in a high dimensional space and the modes occupy a small volume, the chances of hitting one of these good places is just going to be very small. And for now, like I don't think that anyone has found really good solutions. So there's many different ideas have been tried, and they kind of work in some problems, but it remains a big issue. So how could machine learning help with what seems to be an intractable problem? Well, imagine that you have already discovered a few modes that maybe through an MCMC or some other means. Maybe you could use machine learning to guess where other modes could be. So you could learn with a generative model about the interesting places you have found, and where could there be other interesting places? Because this is what generative models do basically at a high level. For example, you can train these models to synthesize images of faces. That's what we worked on in 2014. Now they apply these things to all kinds of stuff. And then it will generate new faces of people that don't even exist, right? So in the example on the top right, I have like a cartoon of why we think this could work. If there is structure in the distribution we're trying to capture, for example, I already found these 3 modes in red. In other words, 3 regions where the reward is high. And the learner kind of notices, the learner being a machine here, of course, notices that they sit near these grid points. Oh, so maybe this other grid point that's nearby would be a good candidate. That's called systematic generalization. It's one of the hottest topics in machine learning. Like, how do we generalize away from the data, but in a way that captures the underlying structure that we don't know ahead of time? So I'm not saying that machine learning can solve this problem, but at least that's what it tries to do. That's what it's designed to do. And GFlowNets are an attempt to exploit that generalization capability in order to do a job which essentially is normally done by these MCMC methods. And by the way, if people have questions at this stage, don't hesitate, because what I've explained is already a little bit abstract and complicated. Okay, so now I'm going to explain how more precisely these GFlowNets are going to do it. Up to now, I told you what we would like to do, and the general idea of using machine learning for that. But now I'm going to go into a bit more detail of more precisely the approach that we've been exploring for the last 6 months or so. So for this, we're going to introduce a formalism based on a graph representing all of the different ways that a query can be constructed. So the approach only makes sense if the experiments, the queries are compositional, meaning they can be constructed through a sequence of decisions. For example, a molecule can be constructed by adding atoms in the right places and picking the right atoms, putting them in the right places where they should be able to bind. So you can think of the process of generating as taking a sequence of stochastic decisions. Stochastic because we want to be able to sample from the distribution with potentially many modes. So we need many possible answers to come out. Okay, so the graph that you're seeing here is illustrating what is going on. Every trajectory in that graph corresponds to one possible such construction of a candidate solution. All the trajectories start from the same root node and they all end up in the same sink node. It's just a way that makes our life easier to formalize things. And then in each state corresponding to a partial solution, we can choose among a finite set of actions. Actually, it could probably easily be extended to infinite, but and there's going to be a policy that we will learn that, given the state, chooses one of the legal actions. For example, you can imagine going back to molecules. If I have already constructed the molecule and we're going to see where we could add an extra atom, not every location is permitted and not every type of species of atom is allowed at that location, obviously. So that's what I mean by at each state, you may have a different set of possibilities. But sometimes it could be a uniform set of possibilities. For example, the sequence might be a sequence of amino acids, and essentially at each step I can choose from the 20 amino acids. So there are many, depending on the problem, one would specify the structure of the action space and the state space that is appropriate. But then the job of machine learning here is going to be to learn that policy. And remember, what we want from that policy is to generate sequences of actions corresponding to these constructed candidate solutions where we're going to sample them with the right probability. So how can we do that? Oh, there's a question, does the sink node have to be a legal configuration? Yes, I mean, no, so sorry, the sink node is no configuration at all. It just means I'm done, right? So for example, in the figure, you see the state S3. Think of it as a molecule. Now we could say we're done and we take this purple transition, I think that would be A7 there, to SF, the sink node, final node. And that's it. When we reach that, we hand out the answer, which is S3. So A7 is just a special action that says we're done. But we could have also continued building on top of S3 and adding more pieces to that molecule, and then only later reach the sink node. Now, there is also a reason why I put a different color on these terminal edges that go into the sink node, because for those edges, we know the amount of unnormalized probability that we would like to see associated with this. So let me now explain the word flow in GFlowNets and in the title of my talk. So we have all these trajectories, and we have a kind of unnormalized probability that we are going to attach to these terminal transitions. In fact, we're going to attach an unnormalized probability to every transition and to every node, to every state. And a way that has helped me to think about this is that this is like a flow network. So think like there is water coming in the root, and the same amount of water is coming out the sink. The amount of water going through any edge is like an unnormalized probability for that edge, and similarly for each node or each state. And then the policy is going to be pick an action coming out of a state in proportion to that flow, that non-negative number that says how much mass do I want relative to the other possibilities to go through that that edge. Okay, so yeah, actually, here's a picture. That helps. We just didn't show the terminal the sync node, but it's essentially the same idea. The important part here is just, oh, you see those little blue dots like water flowing, just to get the intuition of what is going on. And what we're going to be learning with our neural net is the flow function that assigns to any state or any edge the amount of water going through it, the flow or unnormalized probability associated with it. And if that's what we're going to learn, the good news is we already know, going back here, how much flow should be in these terminal transitions. And then the goal of learning is to figure out, given the flow in those terminal transitions or terminal states, how much flow should there be in the other transitions and the other states. So there's a constraint here, which is how much relative probability we want to see in any given terminal configuration. These are the experiments, and the amount of flow there corresponds to what our model, our scoring function, our reward function, our energy function tells us. The energy function says, if you give me a configuration, this is how much flow you should assign to it. Now, if we could like sum over all the possible configurations, like all the possible molecules, but of course that's intractable, to find the partition function, the normalizing constant, and then we would also be able to convert these energies or normalized probabilities to normalized ones. So that's one thing that we will get actually out of the GFlowNet. It's an estimation of that partition function. Okay, so there's a question, transition probabilities between valid intermediate molecules. Yeah, so the transition is going to be defined by the problem. So in chemistry, well, there are like binding constraints. So not every action is possible, and you can't transition from any state to any state in one go. And maybe there are some configurations from which you can't go to other configurations if the actions are only constructive. So one thing I forgot to mention is that the graph here is a DAG. Like there is no cycle, yeah. So the only thing we want to learn is not the structure of that graph, because the structure of the graph is given by what is legal, what is feasible, and what is not feasible. Say for molecules or whatever it is. You could make it completely free and say we're going to allow to go from any state to any state. What you're going to learn are like the transitions, right? So the probability of going from any state to any state. So that's the final product. But the intermediate product are these unnormalized probabilities on the edges. From that, we can derive the policy by just normalizing. But we only need to normalize locally over each of these states, and that usually is a feasible operation. For example, again, with my molecules, I could consider maybe a few hundred different things I could do to add some piece to my given molecule, and I don't need to consider all the transitions from any molecule to any molecule. That would be infeasible. There's a question about, can we impose constraints on the capacity of the edges? I suppose you could, but I haven't worked on this. And I know flow networks usually have these kinds of constraints. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is why we would even expect something like this to be learnable, and why would it work, whereas the traditional MCMC methods could be exponentially expensive. So the trick here, the reason why I think it can work, I already mentioned, is the MCMC method just like here, they just do this blind exploration. The only information they keep about the previously visited states or previously visited configurations and their energies is the last state. But if there is structure in the distribution, like in my very simple example, then you might have a chance to make good guesses, even in a very high dimensional space. And in fact, we've seen generative models be able to make very good guesses in high dimensional spaces. In the worst case, of course, there is no structure, or maybe the structure is not learnable by our particular learning method, and it won't do any better than MCMC. So what has happened? Where does the complexity go? Well, we have to train the GFlowNet, and I'm going to explain how we do that. But in order to train it, we're going to expend some computation. And we already know that training in the worst case and typical machine learning setups can be exponentially hard. But of course, in practice, we have all of these applications of machine learning that tell us that, no, you don't need exponential computation to train. You can get pretty good results that are approximate with fairly small amount, fairly small compared to exponential, fairly small amount of computation. So that's the trick. And now, how are we going to train this? There is a really interesting theorem that is in the first paper, and it hinges on a property of these flows, which is very intuitive. That is, the amount of flow coming into a state has to be equal to the amount of flow coming out of the state. And we're going to define the policy, as I said, as the relative flow of an outgoing edge compared to the sum of the flows on all the outgoing edges from a state, which is also the flow in that state. So that's the definition of our policy. And we have also defined this flow property, the matching of flow incoming and outgoing. And the theorem says that if we are able to train a function that is a flow, in other words, that satisfies these flow matching conditions, and we constrain the flow on these edges at the end, then the probability with which we will sample these trajectories and thus the terminal configurations equals what we want, equals the reward function or e to the minus energy function normalized, even though we don't know that normalizing constant. And in fact, we can recover that normalizing constant by looking into the flow in the initial state. And that should not come as a surprise, right? Because we're saying that we're going to get a flow, and the function that tells us the flow in every state is going to match the flow that we want in those terminal states or terminal transitions. And so it has to be that the flow in the initial state is a sum of all the terminal ones, right? It's just a property of a flow. So that's a very nice theorem. It's actually not that complicated to prove. Now, how do we get a neural net to output a positive number for each of the possible arguments, of which there's an exponential number of, such that we get these properties? Well, we will not be able to guarantee that that flow property everywhere because there's an exponential number of configurations, but we can approximate it, and we can do that by defining a loss function. So this is usually how we train neural nets and other machine learning methods. We can define a loss function that depends on the parameters that we're going to optimize, like the parameters of the neural net that computes the function f here. And we can define various objective functions that all have the property that when we minimize them, we have the desired condition. So here in the equation in the middle, you see this log squared, and it has these two sums, the sums of flows outgoing a state S and a state ST, and the sum of flows incoming into the state ST. And when these two sums are equal, then the loss is 0 for that state ST. So that's one of many possibilities. And while we have the log and the delta here are like minor, like numerical things, but basically we're just trying to get these two things at each state to match. So the way we're going to train this is we're going to sample trajectories. Along those trajectories, we're going to minimize this matching loss that says, make sure the incoming equals the outgoing and penalize, change the parameters to make it more like they match. And that's it. So in terms of how this compares to reinforcement learning methods, it has a lot of the flavors. We're learning a policy, a lot of the flavors of reinforcement learning. This would fall under the category of offline learning because we can actually generate those trajectories for training in a way that doesn't have to be the same as the policy that we learn at the end. So the training policy, so long as it has a full support that it covers all the states basically, can be anything. Of course, some training policies will be more efficient than others. Okay, so that's the most important result, but a lot of things derive from that I will quickly gloss over. So first of all, we can extend this to have conditional flows, which for neural nets is very easy to generalize. Like any kind of function you learn, you can stick extra inputs and they become like conditional something, conditional expectation, conditional probabilities, conditional whatever, conditional generation. So that's not very original, but it turns out that there's a particular kind of conditioning that gives us something that looks a little bit magical. And if we condition on some quantities events that have happened in the beginning of the sequence, so downstream of a state as we construct candidate solutions, downstream of a partial configuration, there will be other partial configurations, and we can condition on, have we visited this other configuration or not? And when we do that, we can use the resulting conditional flow to estimate a free energy, or if you want, an intractable sum of these anomalized probabilities. So more precisely, we can recover the sum of all the flows, the terminal flows, the rewards of all the downstream configurations that could be achieved, all the candidates that could be achieved from a point S if you were to continue like adding molecules. So for example, if I have a molecule S and I want to know all the possible continuations of that molecule, what is their flow? What is their total sum of rewards, the sum of all their exponentiated minus energies? And I don't need to actually compute that sum. I can read it off my neural net, which seems pretty incredible. And because in general, guess what? In general, how do we solve these problems? We would use MCMC. So it's not completely surprising. We can also use these quantities not just to compute kind of these marginalizations, these sums of normalized probabilities, but now we can compute conditional probabilities, like the conditional probability of a downstream configuration given an earlier configuration. So let me just quickly highlight how this approach compares with other things that exist in machine learning. So the main difference with regular reinforcement learning is that regular reinforcement learning is trying to maximize the rewards. It's trying to find a policy, a sequence of actions that gives us the largest possible reward. Whereas here we're trying to sample from the reward function. And that has to do with the title of the first paper, where there's the word diversity, because we're going to be able to sample from all the modes, or if it's an approximation, it's going to sample from many of the modes. Whereas if you use regular, like say PPO, RL methods, once it finds a solution that has a high score, it tends to stay there. And now there are all kinds of methods that have been proposed to introduce more exploration into RL, but it's kind of tricky. And this gives us this kind of exploration sort of for free. And of course, the other difference is we get these other things, these marginalized quantities can be potentially very useful in some applications. Compared with MCMC, so I've already explained, I mean, one thing I didn't say explicitly is we don't need a chain at all. It's like a GAN or a VAE or something. We have a neural net, and we're going to do, you know, if I need 10 actions to construct my solutions, I'm going to do 10 forward passes in my neural net to sample the sequence of actions that give me my solution. So it's kind of one-shot sampling. There's no chain as such. And then, you know, how is that different from regular generative models like the GANs? Well, the generative models are typically trained from positive examples. So, you know, I said earlier, if I had a generative model, maybe I could learn from the modes I visited. So I would only have positive examples, but this GFlowNet can learn from a non-binary signal. So I can look at the negative examples, and I can look at the, you know, in-between examples. It's not just like the examples that are good, but you know, we have these real valued signals, the rewards, the energies that we can take advantage. Yeah, so we think that this can be, I mean, it's a different setup, right? So the thing fundamentally is, whereas generative models, they're trained from a given set of examples, the GFlowNet is trained from a given function, the reward function, the energy function, right? So in one case, we train from a list of examples. In the other case, we train from a piece of code gives us real valued answers. So it's just a different setup. Okay, so we've been starting to investigate how this could be used. Obviously, I've been mentioning how, you know, this might be replacing sometimes MCMC, but it could also complement MCMC. For example, we could use these sampler to propose an initial proposal for MCMC, and then use regular MCMCs if they may give us guarantees we like. And not every problem is interesting for this. For example, we really are going to get a gain if we are in a high dimensional space, the objects are compositional, the modes occupy tiny volume, they're well separated. And also, because we are expending a lot of computation to train the GFlowNet, there's a sort of amortization of the computational costs. Once we've trained, we can sample as much as we want. Whereas for MCMC, for each sample, we have to do a lot of computation. So if I use an MCMC to obtain a single sample, well, it's not clear that it's going to be a computational advantage. I mean, there could still be, because if the MCMC can't even find a single node, but that would be unlikely. So the advantage would come if I need a lot of samples and to cover a lot of the modes, right? There is also a cute thing you could do by changing the reward function. So if I start from a reward function R, I can construct a reward function minus R log R, and you know, this would look like entropy. And indeed, using this modified reward function and the original, and training two GFlowNets, we can estimate entropy of a distribution. And then, of course, we can make conditional GFlowNets, so we can do conditional entropy. And then if you have entropies and conditional entropies, you can do mutual information. So, of course, all of these quantities are intractable, you know, in their own ways. I'm only saying that the better we train these networks, the better they will approximate these things. And if you have enough computation at hand, well, you might be able to find solutions that are better than existing methods in terms of the amount of computation you need compared to the accuracy of your solutions. You know, I mentioned at the beginning, we wanted to create synthesize candidate molecules. Molecules are graphs. Graphs are actually a special case of sets. And so we can apply GFlowNets on sets. And in particular, we can use this marginalization trick to estimate marginal probabilities over sets. So for example, compute the probability of all the supersets of a given set. We can do marginalization over joint distributions because these are just like a special kind of set where the elements are the identity of a variable, like the fourth variable, and the value of that variable. And then we can produce marginals. You can do graphs, and I already mentioned that. You can also train the energy function. In principle, we haven't tried it yet. So up to now, I've assumed that the energy function or the reward function was a given, but where do you get it in the first place? And if you remember in what I talked about, I said we're going to train a model, and that the energy function is going to be sitting in the model, basically. So we could train the model in our usual ways, but it might be interesting to train it as an energy-based model. It has all kinds of nice properties. The problem is that in order to train a parameterized energy function, you need to be able to sample from the corresponding distribution, and in general, that's very hard. So here we may have a way to do this. And we've tried this on molecules, as I said. I'm not going to explain much of the details here, just to say that it converged faster than the competing methods that were in the literature based on MCMCs or RL, and it finds more of the modes faster. So that was very encouraging, and I'm going to stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Yoshua. There were a few more questions that appeared in the chat that I decided to wait for the end. So there's a few questions from Rysart Cherminsky. I hope I say the name right. Maybe Rysart, you can choose one of those and pose it to Yoshua.
Let's see. Yeah, I guess there was a question about, I mean, you mentioned about the theorem incoming and outcoming flow being equal. So I'm curious, is it how is it related to equivalent detailed balance, in statistical physics?
Well, it looks very similar. And in fact, there's another version in the longer paper that I mentioned that's going to come out in a couple of weeks. Longer version of the training objective that is exactly the same form as the detailed balance in probability theory. So I think there's probably interesting connections to make, and then these are probably not completely innocuous.
Okay. So can I have another one?
Yeah.
No, I would actually
sorry.
Like to spread it around. Sorry, Yoshua.
No problem. No problem.
There is Alexander has another question.
Hi, yeah, thank you for the great talk. So my question is, could you use GFlowNets for continuous state spaces as well? I think like thus far in the talk, you've been talking about like molecules, and if I understand that correctly, that's mostly like a discrete state space.
Yes.
So are there additional challenges for the continuous setting, or does it fit like nicely?
So the math should be pretty easy to extend, right? Pretty much everything I've said, except now, when you sample a state given, when you sample an action given a state, you have to sample from a continuous space. So whereas previously, given the unnormalized probability for an action, I would just sum overall the actions to get the probability for any particular one, like I do a softmax or something like this. I would take all the legal actions and then divide them by divide their flows by the sum, and then sample from the corresponding categorical variable. But now, if the actions are continuous, I have to sample from a continuous space. So then in general, that means I have to. It's not obvious how to do that, but there are possible options. For example, you could say that you could decide to parameterize with a conditional distribution. These are conditional distributions. So you could say the conditional distribution is Gaussian or some other thing that we know how to sample from. And if it makes sense in the application you're looking at, then that could be a solution. There may be other solutions, but we haven't really pushed this, neither in the theory nor in the implementations. And sort of answering a question that Risa wrote down. Yeah, so for the discrete case, there's open source code, it's implemented, and Yeah, and we've run it on actually now a number of different cases.
Cool, thank you.
There is a question from Doike Hextra.
Yeah, hi. I was just wondering if at each, I was just thinking about generating molecular conformations, right? And let's say you walk through a protein like we do.
Yeah.
If at every step, for example, you choose a dihedral angle, right? Your number of configurations is going to, your number of states seems to explode, right?
That's right. That's right. This is where GFlowNets are interesting. If the total number of states were small, we wouldn't need this. We would just like sum explicitly.
Okay, so you should be able to treat that kind of case.
Yes. So in fact, we have a project running right now on biological sequences. So in that case, the action space is essentially always the same. And there is a special form of the GFlowNet here because the set of all trajectories forms a tree. In other words, there is only one way to produce a sequence as a to produce a sequence of say amino acids. If you do it in the autoregressive way, like the first one and the second one, we can also, the thing with GFlowNets is we can also train in a non-autoregressive way. So you could say, oh, maybe I'm going to first pick the alpha beta sheets structure or whatever, some abstract structure, and then given these, pick what goes into each piece. So this sort of thing is possible too. If you think about language, people thinking about natural language, even though we pronounce sentences from left to right, like first word, second word, in our head, it's probably not how it's constructed. It's more like what linguists think. So there is some abstract structure, and then we kind of specialize it.
Yeah, I was wondering, the number of actions is not very large, but the number of states is enormous.
Yes, that's right. So this is the case that we can handle. The fact that the number of actions is not very large means at each step in the generation, it's all computable because we normalize only over actions. But of course, the number of states will blow up with the number of actions to the power, the length or something.
Yeah.
If I may ask a question, maybe related, how do you decide for each particular problem the shape of the flow network?
Well, that's completely problem dependent, right? So, and that's where domain experts are important. So I'm going to go back to the example of small molecules, which is the one in the paper. So you could think in small molecules that a natural action space are the atoms that you would, atoms and their positions, like where in the other existing available like electron could you stick another atom. But we found that a better solution was to create an action space that was a little bit more abstract, made of fragments of commonly occurring pieces of molecules. So we just defined a different action space, completely based on sort of chemists' intuitions, and that helped quite a bit, right? So there is this is useful if you have an idea of what's the appropriate state space.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Until someone types, I will get, unless someone types fast, I can ask one more question. Let's see. So I'll ask one more question. So you mentioned this connection with energy landscapes. Let me finish this question, Benjamin, I'll get back to you. So how about energy landscapes that may have time dependence? So for example, if we're looking at proteins and how they may be folding, all these things may be changing in time. Are there applications of that, or can we extend this to time-dependent energy landscapes? I think I see Yoshua frozen. Okay. Jackie, do we still have Yoshua?
We do.
Sorry, I had a power outage.
Oh, okay. So the question is, what about energy landscapes that they depend on time, not only on space? Do you have some ideas about that also?
I mean,
if we think about protein folding or things like that.
Oh, I see what you mean. So really, it doesn't matter as far as this formalism is concerned, how you define the energy function, right? So if the energy function depends on the a trajectory in time, and that's also completely feasible.
Okay. Benjamin Basseri has a question.
Oh, hi there. Yes, I was curious if there was something particular about conditioning on previously visited states that was important for this process, as opposed to any other type of information that might be available, like that might be learned by an attention mechanism.
And what is your question?
If you've tried an attention mechanism, or if there's something special about conditioning on previously visited states.
We haven't implemented this conditioning thing yet. This is all like, there's a lot of things to try. And we just have the math that says, you know, if you can train it with these inputs, this is what you will get. And if the input is a graph, like typically the situation we care about, then yes, you want to use things like transformers, attention mechanisms, set transformers, some sort of neural net that can take a graph as input. So the typical architecture we use is a transformer-like architecture, takes a graph as input, outputs a number. Or maybe to make it a bit more efficient, outputs a different number for each of the possible actions that are allowed for that input.
Other questions? Maybe I can continue until another one appears. So in Markov chain Monte Carlo, sometimes one of the issues is their parallel implementation. If you want to use parallel machines, these algorithms are kind of sequential, so it may be a little bit difficult. There are some variations, MCMC. I was wondering if these flow networks, how suitable are they for parallel machines, or if you had any ideas in that direction?
Yeah, so we can write on all the really good work that's been done to engineer transformers for things like language models and other data structures. So these types of neural nets, they work on sequences and graphs, and the code has been optimized to run in batches where you're going to take like 100 or even 1,000 different inputs in parallel, and then compute the output for all of them together. And yeah, and that could be done. I mean, we can just exploit that, and we have been in the implementation. So you can exploit parallel computing, you can exploit GPUs and so on, which are extremely important for neural nets these days, if some of you know.
Okay, we are approaching the hour. We reached the hour. Is there a last question that anybody would like to ask Yoshua?
I guess if I can.
Yeah, Raisa gets the last question.
Yeah, I think you touched on this a little bit when you mentioned fragments, because my question was, is the relation between transitions you are considering and, you know, let's say some kind of chemical reaction, basically chemical transformation.
That's right. You can choose you can choose the action space as you want. And so yeah, in chemistry, a very natural action space that would solve the synthesizability problem is reactions. So rather than fragments, you could have reactions. Actually, we had a paper about using reinforcement learning to synthesize new molecules where the action space is a set of reactions that are applicable to some current candidate, partial candidate. Previously, we haven't tried it on GFlowNets, but yeah, you would certainly, you know, that would be a natural thing to do. And it would also eliminate the issue of whether the molecules you synthesize, you propose are synthesizable. Thanks for your question.
And I would like to thank very much, first of all, Yoshua for this wonderful presentation and for taking the time, Leslie for making the introductions, and all of you for participating in today's distinguished lecture series. And we hope to see you in the next talk. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.